Today's episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast is sponsored by Web Healer. You're a counsellor in private practice and you need a website, or you've got an existing website which you need help with. Web Healer are offering Counselling Tutor Podcast listeners, that's you, £100 off the cost of a website design and build. Now, Web Healers specialize in websites for counselors and psychotherapists. It's what they do. And the Web Healer team provide a completely non-technical, done-for-you solution, leaving you to focus your time on your clients. Operating for 20 years, Web Healer are a trusted resource amongst counselors when it comes to getting your practice online. So get the package details and claim your £100 off coupon for your new website by going to counsellingtutor.com/website. That's counsellingtutor.com/website.
Hello and welcome to episode 340 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. I'm Rory, and today we're turning toward a subject that's too often left in the shadows: male sexual abuse. It's an uncomfortable truth for many, one that challenges deep-rooted ideas about masculinity, vulnerability and power. When we talk about sexual abuse, the focus tends to fall almost exclusively on women and girls. And while their experiences must always be honoured and never minimised, there's another reality that too often goes unspoken: the silence surrounding male survivors. Why is it so hard for society to see, hear, or believe that boys and men can be victims too? Why is their suffering so often dismissed, doubted, or ignored? That is why I'm pleased to be speaking with today's guest, Jeremy Sachs, a therapist, advocate, and author of a forthcoming book due out in July of 2025 with the title An Intersectional Guide for Male Survivors of Sexual Abuse and Their Allies, Masculinity Reconnected. Jeremy brings a rare combination of professional insight and deep compassion to this sometimes overlooked topic. I think you'll find his perspective both grounding and thought-provoking. And with that said, let's roll the intro.
Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for counsellors, psychotherapists, and counselling students. Here are your hosts, Rory Oakes and Ken Kelly.
A very warm welcome to episode 340 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Rory Oakes and myself, Ken Kelly, are delighted to welcome you to our three topics today, kicking off with that ethical, sustainable practice, where today the topic is, can clients ask you to delete their data? So they've worked with you and then they say, I don't want you having any data on me. We're going to be looking deep into that. Then we're going to practice matters. Rory has already beautifully teed up Jeremy, who's going to be speaking on male sexual abuse. And then we go into student services, where today we're going to be looking into the theory of Mr. Carl Rogers, and we're looking at the 7 stages of process, but we're really going to simplify it down. What is it? How does it work? And what does it look like? So that's 7 stages of process in student services. But kicking us off, and that's ethical, sustainable practice, we go into, I guess, legislation territory here, Rory, where we're speaking about data. We speak often about UK GDPR, collection, retention, management of data. But we get to the point where somebody asks us to delete their data. Can they do that? Maybe we need to hold it. I mean, the BACP says we've got to hold their data and their records. What do we do?
Yes, it's an interesting and complex question to answer. It was asked in our Facebook group, and if you want to be a member of our Facebook group, if you go to Facebook, pop in Counselling Tutor, you'll find us there. And it was part of quite a lively discussion, and no one seemed to have a definitive answer. And before we jump into this topic, I'd like to remind the listener that Ken and myself are counsellors, not lawyers. So I, as data controller for Counselling Tutor, I've looked at the question and I'm answering it in this way. We're answering it in this way. So, of course, the client can ask you to delete the data. They can ask you for anything. It's whether you comply with that and what defence you can put up to say you can't delete it. Now, to look at this in a bit more depth, we're talking about UK general data protection regulations. But if you're listening, in another part of the world, almost certainly you'll be governed by some form of data protection legislation. So if you are listening outside the UK, might be worth you looking at whoever is the regulator for data in your geographical area and asking the same question that our Facebook commentators asked. So under Article 17 of UK GDPR, the legislation that came in 2018, you can keep personal data under certain conditions. So personal data would be things like phone numbers, contact details, client notes, referral letters, any financial transactions. That's data. That's things that belong to the client. If the client's paid you, they'll be paid you from a bank, so you'll have their bank details. And under GDPR, there's something called the right to erasure, or sometimes it's called the right to be forgotten. Now, a client can request you delete data if it's no longer needed for the purpose it was collected. So say, for instance, a client phones you up and is thinking of having some therapy and doesn't go through with it, and you have their phone number. They could ask you to delete that phone number. You should anyway, I think, if you're not would be working with a client. And it's no longer needed. You're not working with the client. There's no reason for you to have their phone number, and you can remove it. Or they can withdraw their consent where there's a lawful basis for processing. Now, I think a good example of that is maybe you've signed up personally for some kind of newsletter, or you've signed up for some offers, and the product that you're wanting, it might be a grocery item, you no longer want it. You can ask the people who are sending you the newsletter or posting it to you to delete the data so they no longer have it. So when does this right of erasure apply? When can someone actually say to you, I want you to erase the data? Well, if it's no longer needed for the purpose it was collected. So say, for instance, a potential client rings you up, leaves information and says they're interested in working with you, and you don't go ahead for whatever reason that is. You still have their phone number. And I mean, good practice would be, if you're not working with a client, would be to delete that anyway, because you've got no reason to have the information. You don't need to have their information. But if they said, I want you to delete it, you could delete it. There's no reason for you to have it. That's fine. Or they withdraw their consent. So again, they might phone up and say, you have my data, you have my phone number, can you delete it? That's fine. Or the data was processed unlawfully. And that might be that someone's decided to start phoning people up sort of ad hoc and ask if they want therapy, and getting lists of phone numbers. That would be unlawful. You can't cold call people and say, do you want therapy? Or you're legally required to erase the data, which I've really covered in the right to erasure. Now, we come to the area where a counsellor can decline to delete data. So things like, if the data is needed for a legal obligation, so things like tax, if you're being paid out into a bank account, almost certainly your bank will have the client's details. When you get your bank statement, it'll have the name and the bank account. Now, you need that for tax purposes, because if the tax people say, well, where are you getting your money from? You've declared your tax for this year, but where's that coming from? If they want to look at your bank accounts, if you've deleted that data, well, they may say, well, look, you have to prove where your money's come from. And also that data's stored by your bank, and they probably won't delete it either. And I think probably more pertinent to therapists is required for exercise or defence against legal claims in case of complaint or investigation. So, we are asked to take client notes, and, if a client makes a complaint, then one of the things that professional bodies will ask for is notes. Or if a client takes, their abuser to court and they ask for their notes, then we have to supply them. And necessary reasons for public interest, such as safeguarding of public health, not something that perhaps would affect counsellors too much, but those are the reasons. So the answer to the question is that we can, in some cases, decline clients' requests to delete their information. And I would say at this point, it's really useful to have all this in a contract. We've spoken about this on the podcast a lot, haven't we, Ken? About the importance of contracting and the importance of being transparent right from the very beginning you contract with a client. So it's always best to have a policy that they can see of why and how you keep data, so they understand that. And at that point, they may say, well, that's fine, that's okay. Or they may say, well, I don't want you to have my information, so I'm not willing to give it you. So your probably therapy shouldn't take place. And I think probably, Ken, it would be good just to reinforce the point of the importance of contracts.
Yes, definitely. This is a tricky subject because we're speaking about legislation. So we're talking about the law. And when we're speaking about the law, we may not be fully read in on all the moving parts of that. So listening to this podcast, I would not recommend that you take this information and implement it. If you find yourself in a situation where a client is saying, I want you to delete my data, and you hold a certain amount of data on that client, I would suggest that you contact the Internet Information Commissioner's Office, the ICO, if you are in the United Kingdom. If you're in the United Kingdom and you're collecting a client's data, you're going to have to register with the ICO in the first place anyway. And part of their service is to offer you support. So I guess one of the things is, if somebody asks you to delete their data, you do have a grace period. You don't have to do it immediately. It doesn't have to be done within 12 or 24 hours. You do have a time frame to do that in, which allows you to think about it, to note down what you've been asked, and then to get the right recommendation and guidance on that. And I would be going to the ICO rather than your ethical body. The ethical body is taking care of you as a counsellor and your ethical practice. The ICO is taking care of you as a person that holds data that people share with you. So that's kind of just underlining, Rory, your disclaimer at the beginning that we're not the experts on this. However, it's an important topic. It's been had in our Facebook group, so we will always discuss those important topics. Now, if we look to our ethical bodies, and I'm going to use a UK ethical body as an example, where they may suggest that you would keep a client's data and the notes associated to that client for 6 years after the therapeutic relationship ends, and that's for adults. And if they are children, then up until that person is 25 years old. So you can be holding that data for a significant amount of time. So that there is the ethical body's stance on it. However, if there is a request to remove that data, then we need to think differently. Now, this is where it becomes tricky, because I'm going to use an example here, and this is just 100% hypothetical. Let's say we've worked with a client. We've worked with that client for 3 months. The client decides that they're going to move on from counselling. They're feeling much better now, and they say, I'm leaving now, and I don't want you to have any of my data. Our relationship is finished. You had the data for the job that was intended. I want you to delete that data. Well, what would happen, and what kind of a situation would you be in if a couple of months later that client laid a complaint? Maybe they went on into their life and realized something and then thought, you know what, that wasn't right, and lays a complaint against you. Your ethical body then calls upon you, and you don't have any data to back up your stance with that client. A darker scenario that may play out is if that person chooses to take their own life, and you may be contacted by the coroner who has a legal right to ask you for the records and data that you have on this client. So first thing you would do is if you were deleting data, you would do it with guidance from something like the ICO, or look at who governs the data legislation in your country. You would then make sure that you note that down, so that if you are called upon, you can say what you did and why you did it, and that you were consulted. So defendable decision making. And of course, as you said, Rory, if you have your contract where you very clearly outline your data policy, that is going to stand you in good stead as well. So the client coming in understands and knows how you manage, keep, and store data that they may share with you. And then, again, I want to play a little bit of devil's advocate here, Rory, and introduce a new side to this. I think what we can do here is look at what is the definition that is considered identifiable data of a client. So the logical ones are their name. It might be their email address. It might be their address that they live at, their home address. All of those, it might be their telephone number. All of those are recognizable data points that can be mapped to that person. However, I remember when I was learning about note-taking back in my student days, I learned something called the split note system, where you would have a ambiguous numbering system that only you as the counsellor truly understood, that number 169 would relate to client X, and within 169 notes, that client's name would never be mentioned, just how they presented, what they presented with, and what the outcome of that was, and it would always only be referred to as client 169 or whatever the number is in your split note system. And I don't know the answer to this, but I wonder if that would be considered data that was mappable back to that person in the eyes of the legislation. Because once the notes are gone, once you have absolutely no information of your process with that client, I guess you may find yourself in a difficult place if you are asked for it at a later stage. So not really the easiest of answers in this one, Rory, other than the things we say so often. Make sure you know your legislation. Make sure you have your contract up to date, and consult with the ICO that you should be registered with anyway as a counsellor or psychotherapist if you are receiving any data or storing any data from a client. And that can just be their name and email address in your inbox. That is still their data, and you are storing it.
Yes. And we've not really talked about the insurance company, because obviously as a therapist, you will have insurance. And some insurance companies are very, very prescriptive in how long you should keep data for. And they may say 7 years after the client has finished with you, or in the case of young people, up to the age of 25, so 7 years after they turn 18. And some don't have a policy on that. So I think the ultimate answer is, if you're unsure, speak to your insurance company, professional body, or the information commissioner's office, and take a view, and also try to get their advice in writing. having a phone conversation and saying, well, I spoke to someone on the phone and they said this and they said that, doesn't really stack up legally. What you need is actual written responses that you can store up. I would imagine, Ken, if we come into the real world, that it would be very, very unlikely that you would get a client who would contact you and say they wanted all their information erased. I'm sure it does happen, but I'm sure it's not a regular event. But I think, the whole point of us discussing this is to kind of hope for the best and prepare for the worst. And, if we've discussed it today in the hope that we can kind of raise awareness and signpost people into what they need to think about should they get a request to remove data.
Yes, it's a heavy topic, this, and it turns around every now and then, and no doubt it's going to turn again. And just some parting thoughts on this. Part of the UK GDPR legislation says that we only keep the data as long as it is required from a client. So if we do see a client and they don't ask for the erasure of that data, after 6 years, do you have in your practice something that triggers off to remind you to remove that client's details? And how do you do that? How do you delete that data? We've spoken about it in another podcast, and we're not going to go into any depth here. But it's just, I guess, it underlines the importance of recognizing that data compliance is now something that we have to take very, very seriously. It is a legislation, so we don't get to pick or choose whether we do it. We have to do it. It is the law, and it's good CPD to do. I know we've got a UK GDPR lecture in the CPD library, just explaining it and kind of giving the basic overview of what you need to do as a therapist. And we've made a super duper handout for you on this tricky topic here, with a big disclaimer and links to the ICO and everything you'll need in there from us. And it's called "Can Client Ask You to Delete Their Data? Understanding the Right to Erasure under UK GDPR." If you're somewhere else in the world, use this as a guide and look to your own data laws within your country. And where can you get that? Well, you just go to counsellingtutor.com, because that's our website. Click on the podcast tab, because that's what you're listening to, our podcast, and go to episode 340. You can just put 340 in the search and it'll come up. And it's there on the page. You can download it. It is free. And that is the free handout. And if you're interested in the CPD library, where we have a lecture on this topic, same place, counsellingtutor.com, click on products, and the CPD library for qualified therapists is there for you. Whoa, heavy topic, and feeling like quite a heavy podcast today as we go into yet another heavy topic. Rory, you spoke with Jeremy on male sexual abuse.
Yes, I had a conversation with Jeremy Sachs, who's just written a book on male sexual abuse. And it was a very enlightened conversation. I spoke to Jeremy about issues around male sexual abuse and his forthcoming book. And this is what he had to say.
Practice Matters is proudly sponsored by the Counsellor CPD Library. To access top quality, relevant continuing professional development for your practice that you can do at a time that suits you, and all for less than the price of a cup of coffee, visit counsellingtutor.com.
My guest today is Jeremy Sachs. Jeremy is joining us today to discuss some of the key points from his new book, An Intersectional Guide for Male Survivors of Sexual Abuse and Their Allies, Masculinity Reconnected. So, Jeremy, you're so welcome.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me. It's really lovely to be here, to be able to plug away at my book. Thank you.
Well, indeed, and it sounds like it's quite an important book, because we do know that there's still a lot of work to be done, I think, with male survivors of sexual abuse. I don't know if you'd agree with me on that.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think I think we have come a long way, but I think as you'll no doubt have experienced conversations around masculinity continue to change and gender continue to change. And of course, these things feed directly in to the experience of survivorhood. So while there has been a start, I feel like it's an ever-evolving conversation. And of course, some of the stigmas and the shame and all of the nastiness that's associated with it is so perpetual still for men. So yeah, in short, I agree.
Absolutely. So what inspired you to write the book, and why was it important to frame it through an intersectional lens?
Well, I think I'd been working with male survivors for a while. I'd been running groups for men for about 2 years, and then sort of branched out into working with young men, so 13 years old and upwards, and then trans men and non-binary mask folk. And within all of that work, you sit there and you are sitting with a group of people who are bringing such broad life experiences. And one of the really very touching things about these groups is that I've sat in fewer in I can't think of more sort of tolerant and diverse and engaged groups that I've sat in than sitting in a group of male survivors. And everybody having their own life experience. And yet there is something about sexual trauma, there is something about the shame that survivors experience, particularly through a lens of masculinity, that is very sort of unifying. So actually there's something, I think, in a conversation about what it is to come to the topic of sexual abuse and masculinity through an intersectional lens. There's there's a few very good books on it, but what they don't look at is this intersectional element of it. They don't say, what is it to be a man of a certain background, a working class background, or if you're a trans black man, or if you're a white 40-year-old man, the lives we lead before, during, and after a sexual trauma impact the severity of the trauma itself or our capacity to heal from it. And I think that dynamic is rarely spoken about in survivor circles and healing circles.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I would totally agree with you. And you explore the concept of masculinity in the context of healing. So how do traditional notions of masculinity impact on survivors of sexual abuse? And how can we begin to redefine it in healthier ways?
I think that's a really lovely question. And I'll tell you what, it's actually one that I struggled with when writing. If I tell you an anecdote about it, there's a whole chapter on masculinity. And I was writing and I sent it to a colleague to sort of proofread, and they were like, what's your problem with traditional masculinity? And actually a lot of the ways that our patriarchal society and traditional masculinity has wounded me as a man came out on the page. And I reread it and I hadn't realized the anger that I felt towards men in my life as a child or as an adult, and the sort of the adaptations that I had needed to make that had, influenced my life in perhaps negative ways. And I had to rewrite it going, actually, there is nothing inherently wrong with traditional masculinity if you're somebody who wants to identify with it and all of the really good things about it, the sort of the provider, the protector, the strength, the leader. These are not inherently bad things, but what we have seen is these elements being co-opted to really marginalize alternative forms of masculinity, to sell us ideologies. Well, for anything from ideologies to protein shakes, these sort of ideas become and are weaponized against men, and to the point of, that term toxic masculinity, which has been about for a while, but feels very prevalent now. And I would say when it gets to the point of toxic masculinity, it becomes the natural enemy of male survivors, because toxic masculinity doesn't allow men to, age past their 30s. It doesn't allow men to be victims of crimes. It doesn't allow men to seek emotional support. And these are all things that male survivors certainly, I think, benefit from. But when traditional masculinity gets co-opted and warped into an oppressive system, be that through sort of the marginalization of minorities, be that through sort of capitalist schemes to tell you, buy this product because, you're not man enough. Either way, it becomes a really oppressive force for men generally, and especially, I would argue, for male survivors.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree totally with that. Now, your book discusses the guidance for allies. What are some of the most meaningful ways that allies can support male survivors, and especially, I guess, in communities where this topic is often silenced or not spoken about?
That's a really lovely question as well. I think it's really, I hope it's really broad. What the book aims to do is each chapter is introduced with a testimony from a survivor talking about the topic of the chapter. Then in the chapter, there are activities sort of that can range from CBT formulations around things like shame, right the way through to very simple questions to ask ourselves. And then at the end of the chapters, there are sort of coping strategies and activities that hopefully allow survivors and those who support them to have some really tangible tools to think about their survivorhood, think about the support they need. Not every single one is going to work for every single person, but that's why there's multiple. And then after that, the book, at the end of each chapter, it signposts to podcasts, to films, to further books and readings. So that's one way. It gives the allies an insight into testimony. It gives some practical tools. But it also, the final chapter is specifically for allies. And this is for allies who might be loved ones of survivors, a wife, a husband, a child. Right the way through to social workers, psychotherapists, counsellors, psychiatrists, this sort of thing. It talks about care plans, how to create a care plan for ourselves as well as for survivors we support. Talks a little bit about what our internal biases can be. Ideas about masculinity are everywhere. So we might carry some unconscious or conscious bias about how we want men to be, how we want male survivors to be. So a little bit of that, a little bit of a sort of Jungian wounded healer, and also acknowledges that actually if you are a professional working in the field of sexual abuse, sometimes, but more often than not, it's not an accident that you work in that field. A lot of us are professionals or loved ones who support survivors who will have our own traumas. Doesn't mean it's sexual trauma, but we will have some understanding of what it is to be to encounter relational trauma. So just acknowledging that as well. So I hope there's a great deal of richness in it. I invite sort of therapists of different modalities to approach it creatively, bringing their own modalities and practice into what is already in the pages.
Yeah, I'm just listening to what you were saying, certainly about kind of how male masculinity is framed. I remember many years ago reading a book by Naomi Wolf called The Beauty Myth, and how, and this is her words, not mine, I have to be very clear here, but she kind of put forward the idea in the book that women are sold a certain kind of femininity for the benefit of manufacturers of cosmetics and clothes, and the diet industry and the fitness industry. And it was published a good few years ago. And I think it's interesting, just looking at the magazine racks. I was in Tesco buying my tea bags the other day, and I wandered past the magazine racks, and I saw so many magazines with men, promoting men's health, and they all seem to have very muscular, very young men, a good deal of Photoshop, because being an ex-photographer, you can see it a mile off. A little bit of AI, I think, in one case. And I did wonder if you were a younger man and you were looking at that, and certainly didn't fit that kind of mould, that could be pretty, pretty reductionist, in that someone might look at that and feel that for some reason they're not a man. Is that a thing? Are my observations valid when I say that sometimes that picture of masculinity isn't exactly what masculinity is, or it's one version?
Well, I think we're wandering into really murky territory, that we're repeating some of the very insidious mistakes we've made for women and the constrictions of femininity. Now we're taking that and putting that onto men. I would take your point about magazines, and I would say, add to it. I mean, look at Marvel films. Disney Marvel films for superhero films that are aimed at children, and look at the actors. Look at their hairlines. Look at their teeth. Look at their six packs. These are aimed at children. And of course, what some pockets of masculinity talk about is sort of things like biohacking and sort of different terminologies around nutrition, and what they're doing is talking about disordered eating.
Yes,
but it is dressed up in this new form of sort of masculinity that's sold as wellness and sold as well-being, and then we have some on the mental health front. We have some very controversial public figures writing sort of self-help books about how men sort of rules for life, whether it's stoicism, whether it's sort of this 10-point plan, and there's such rigidity, I think, to masculinity that is really dressed up as quite liberal and freeing, but actually it is reductionist, and it is, I believe, repressive. And I think what you're getting into, that sort of photoshopped AI'd image of masculinity on the front cover of magazines sold as healthy. We see the sort of the spiritual, the mental versions of that too. They really want to package and reduce what masculinity is, and I think that sets us up to fail. I think it sets male survivors up to fail, certainly, but I think it sets all men up to fail, really. And of course, what then happens, it becomes this feedback loop where men do need help. The systems in place, the self-help books or the workout plans or the biohacking sort of protein diets, they fall away, they don't work. And men are left with very little tools to be able to support themselves. Yes. All of these things may work for a while. There's a part in the book that talks, not to just plug the book, but there's a part that talks about belief systems, and how men, I think, are particularly susceptible to belief systems. Some are really, really effective, and I don't want to say they're all negative. Some men are abused, will find religion, and that is an incredibly useful tool for them. Some men are abused in a religious context, and their faith will be something incredibly difficult for them to negotiate. And some men will be abused, know about abuse in religious institutions, and rage against, these institutions. But all's to say, you get these beliefs, whether it's religion, whether it's a self-help book, whether it's sort of online forums, they can be really powerful tools for healing, or they can be really harmful. They can be really reductive, really stringent, and really repressive. that conversation around them is really useful.
Yes, and I know one of the things I've noticed through the years, we touched on Jung, and one of the things I like about Jung was archetypes.
Yes.
And we see it all the time, don't we? You just have to drive down the road and look at some of the posters that feature men. I mean, women are not immune from this, I have to say. No. But you know, you look at some of the archetypes, and they feature a very singular view of men. And I speak as someone who was pounded to death on the rugby pitch in the 70s. And, you know, I just didn't conform to what my PE teacher, who hopefully now is dead because I hated him, quite frankly, you know, it didn't conform to what he believed was masculine. I had other ideas about it. But, you know, I think thankfully we might be I hope we'll be moving slowly away from that, certainly in schools. You talk about the importance of community in male survivors. And what is the importance of community in terms of healing or finding support?
Well, I think, you know, for men, sexual abuse rarely happens in a vacuum. It is something that is corrosive and insidious, and often there are other types of abuse. And if there aren't other types of abuse, there's often other, you know, adverse childhood experiences, or there are other health inequalities, you know. And so I think community can be really useful in a few ways. I think one, community is about connection. It's about acceptance. It's a bit of an antidote to the shame we can feel as survivors. Trauma often says to us, the world is dangerous. It is better to be alone. It is better to sever for connections, because we know connections are harmful and damaging and painful. You know, this is the legacy of trauma. And while that works for a time, it becomes an incredibly isolating place. And it becomes a place where the trauma feeds itself. It becomes very perpetual. So connection, now this can be connection in a survivors group. Men can find a group where they can talk about their abuse, or they can find a group that has nothing to do with their abuse. I think both have real merit when it comes to healing from this sort of trauma. But there is something about connection that is so important. We need it as humans. We need it like we need air. And it helps us. It offers us a reflection of ourselves that maybe isn't as ugly and corrupt as we feel it should be because of abuse. So that's one thing. Another thing is we know that men from minoritized communities, but also all men, will face some sort, or can face some sort of oppression from systemic systems that are there to supposedly help them. So if you are a gay man or a black man going to the criminal justice system to report a rape, might be loaded with different forms of oppression, might be loaded with potential for further violence or disbelief. We know, because of the Baroness Louise Casey report after Sarah Everett murder and rape, that the Met was found to be racist, misogynistic and homophobic. We know that after the chemsex killer Stephen Port killed multiple gay men and the police didn't put the evidence together quick enough to save people's lives, despite bodies being found in the same graveyard and at his door, the assumption that gay men just die because they're reckless. We know that the Home Office in 2022 reported that a lot of police officers think that reports of rape are just a report of regretful sex. And from anecdotal testimony from the men I've talked to who hear from healthcare professionals saying, oh, there's no bruises on you. Are you sure it was rape? You know, we know that these systems can do more harm than good. They can inflict more violence than good. So us finding community, one, allows us to ease some of the shame, and B, hopefully allows us to move on in a way that isn't relying on systems that can be oppressive to all men, and particularly marginalised men.
Very, very powerful. And I guess that brings us to the end of this powerful conversation. So I would say to the listener, did today's discussion resonate with you or someone you know? If so, I encourage you to check out an intersectional guide for male survivors of sexual abuse and their allies, Masculinity Reconnected. It's published by Routledge and it'll be available in your favourite bookstore starting in July 2025. It just remains for me to say, Jeremy Sachs, thank you for joining us.
Massive thank you to Jeremy Sachs. Thank you to you, Rory, for holding those all-important conversations and bringing us the information. We now move on to student services. Student services recognising you, students, on your formal journey to become a counsellor, psychotherapist, or just to gain the skills, counselling skills, listening skills that you can use in your everyday life. And today we're speaking about a little bit of theory. It's from the person-centred approach, Mr. Carl Rogers himself, and we're speaking about the 7 stages of process. But we need to simplify this because it can, I guess, become quite a complex theory. I think people trip themselves up on it, Rory. What do we need to know?
Well, I think the first thing we need to know about the 7 stages of the process is probably the most undervalued part of Rogers' theories. And if we think of the arc of person-centred therapy, it was really developed over quite a substantial amount of time. Rogers didn't come up with his theory in 6 months. It took him almost a decade, if not more. And it started off with Rogers kind of pinning his colours to the mast in his book, Client-Centred Therapy in 1951, where he talks about the philosophical underpinnings of his ideas. And he talks about phenomenology, he talks about Heidegger and Husserl, and he talks about Søren Kierkegaard, all the philosophers who would talk about phenomenology. We might actually now call that, in our modern day terms, lived experience. So it started off with that in 1951. And then in 1957, he published the 6 necessary and sufficient conditions for therapeutic change in the Consulting Journal of Psychology. We would know that, it's sometimes referred to as the core conditions, which is not quite accurate, but the 6 necessary and sufficient conditions. And that really was the approach that a therapist took to the work. And then 4 years later, Rogers published in a way of On Becoming a Person, his book On Becoming a Person, the 7 stages of process. And I think, and I've spoken to other people who would kind of agree with me, 7 stages of process were a way of measuring the theory, how people changed through the arc of therapy. It's a qualitative view of the change of people. And just to remind people what qualitative is, it is observation of change. It's usually done through case by interviews of people, talking to people, how they've changed. That's qualitative. Quantitative is where you're looking at statistics and numbers. So the 7 stages of the process is a qualitative view on how people change through the arc of therapy. And Rogers did that in 7 specific stages. And I think I'm going to call this out, Ken. I think it's probably one of the most undervalued parts of Rogers' theory, yet the most important, because it gives us so much to talk about in supervision, and it helps us understand where clients are at any point of the exit of therapy.
Student Services is sponsored by Counselling Skills Academy. Can't tell you how many times Rory and I have heard counselling students say that learning skills and knowing that they're using them effectively is really, really challenging. The reason for this is because we don't get to see another counsellor using skills in a real live session. In reality, this means that we're asked to learn something that we can never see demonstrated in a real setting. And it's no wonder that many of us are left feeling unsure. If If you want to see counselling skills used in real sessions by qualified therapists, so this is real sessions, real presentations, and real use of skills, then go to counsellingskillsacademy.com. There's some free videos on skills, including a full live session that you can have a look at. Gain the competence and the confidence of knowing you're using your counselling skills effectively. Just visit counsellingskillsacademy.com.
In my preparation for this, doing a little bit of research, I was reminded of the wording from rigidity to fluidity. And this is kind of what the 7 stages of process map. So Carl Rogers' 7 stages of process describes the journey a person goes through in therapy from rigidity and defensiveness to openness and that self-actualization that you spoke about, Rory. It maps how a client gradually becomes more congruent, authentic, and in touch with their inner experience through a safe and accepting therapeutic relationship. And yes, we can kind of look at the theory unfolding, as you were, as a person is growing, moving from rigidity to fluidity, we can see the mapping of that movement. But it also is really useful in assessment stage. When you first meet with that client and they kind of first present with where they find themselves and where they are, you can kind of get a feeling. And I'm going to say this as blatantly as it is, whether it is ethical to work with them. Because if we look at stage one is an unwillingness to communicate about self. And if we know that we need to have a connection with that person, where that person knows why they are here, we know why they are here, and we're working together for a mutual outcome, somebody in stage 1 is not going to be ready to look at that. So the description of stage 1 is the person is rigid, they're defensive, they're not open to change in any way, shape or form. They're going to blame others or external situations and avoid talking about any of their own internal feelings. If you had a job like mine, it would look like you would feel like this. If you had a marriage like mine, it would feel like this. It's not me, it's always them. And a real life example of that would be a person forced to attend therapy by their employer after conflicts at work, and they come in and they say, I don't have a problem. It's them. They're out to get me, and that's why they're sending me here, because they want me to comply. Well, good luck going down a therapeutic road with that person. It is almost, in fact it is, it's unethical. There is no psychological contact within that relationship to build on, to build a therapeutic relationship. I'm going to go into stage 2, Rory, and then I'll hand over to you, because there's 7 of them, so we'll tennis them over. Stage 2 is the beginning of that external recognition of problems, just starting to see that there is an external recognition, and the person recognizes that problems exist but still sees them as external to themselves. It's not me, it's the world is against me. They may discuss issues very intellectually, always thinking right from the mind, but they may remain emotionally disconnected. So you wouldn't hear them say words like I feel, or speaking about any forms of emotions. And a real life example of that is a person coming to therapy saying, I guess my marriage isn't great, he just doesn't get me anymore. And that person is beginning to engage but still blaming the other person. And that, I guess we might be able to start working with that person. There's at least some recognition that there is a problem and that they maybe share part in that, Rory. And then, of course, stage 3, that's tentative self-expression, where the person begins to talk about the personal feelings and experiences. And that's where I hand over to the maestro himself, Rory.
Well, thank you very much, Ken. So, just pick up on stage 3. I think there's a sense that that's a place where people usually, it's a common stage where people enter therapy, stage 3. And they're beginning to take personal responsibility for self. Maybe they're generalizing, maybe they're pointing fingers and saying it's other people. But their focus is more on the past than present. So they may say, well, I feel angry at what's happened in the past, and but then again, everybody does. They're not focusing on self. And I think what's useful here is that very early stage of entering therapy, that unconditional positive regard is essential to allow clients to be able to explore themselves and to begin to sort of go on the process of unpacking who they are and wanting to look more towards a future of who they are. And then we move on to stage 4. And in stage 4, we're talking really about clients discussing here and now feelings. So a client who says, I'm feeling right now that this is happening to me, or I feel right now this particular feeling, I feel really sad about this. And they're also looking for more involvement in the therapeutic relationship. They may be looking to the therapist for validation or support, but crucially, they could possibly still not build that trust. So what we do see in the 7 stages of the process, I think, is that this could be very early work. This could be right at the beginning of therapy, or as we move into maybe 2 or 3 sessions where the client is working out who they can trust. And of course, trusting the therapist is part of the process of therapy. And also, I think counsellors need to be very careful. Counsellors, therapists use it interchangeably, not to collude with any kind of distancing. Say, oh, well, this is what I always do. I'm always doing this. We hear that so often. I'm always having these relationships, always fall into this trap. And not to collude with that, and not say things like, it seems like you're always falling into these traps and this is the way of your life. I think it's really about focusing on here and now feelings. And then we move to stage 5. And I think a real quick kind of way of navigating stage 5 is where a client comes in, sits down in your office or your therapy room and says, I am going to change this. I am not putting up with this anymore. And if it's it's a relationship, I've left this person. I wasn't happy with this relationship. I'm now I'm taking action, or being prepared to take action, and also saying that they're now in control of their lives. They've gone from this position where I feel out of control. I feel that my life isn't in my control, to very much being in control. And this is a very productive stage in therapy. It means that they're beginning to harness their own organismic valuing, as they'd say in the theory. In other words, they're becoming less incongruent, more congruent with themselves. They're listening to their internal compass and saying, this is the direction I want to go, and this is who I want to be, and these are the decisions that I'm making. And then finally, we go into stage 6. And I think it's important to also note that the first 5 stages can be quite fluid. So people may go backwards and forwards in those stages. And also, I think, depending on which literature you read, usually it's stage 5 is usually where therapy comes to an end, or is an ending of therapy. Stage 6 is where the client recognises their own process towards self-actualization and starts to accept the pain that they have. And that can be an existential pain. That could be the fact that really they have to make their own decisions, and that in doing that they need to trust their own judgment and feel self-love. And that stage 6, and I don't know what your thoughts on this are, Ken. I've read a lot, and in my own practice I've observed this. Stage 6 usually takes place as a growing development and a process of personal growth after therapy's ended. It's usually something that people build on as they move through their life, and they're unlikely to regress at that point. They're more likely to continue trusting their inner voice, their inner compass, to be able to be with real here and now responses and take ownership of their own life. I don't know your thoughts on stage 6, but I always thought, Ken,
Yes.
that's usually something you never really see in a therapy room. It's that forward journey after therapy.
Yes. Yes. Just to put in, if you hear any banging noises in the background, I've got some scaffolding that has just been pulled down at the moment, so you may hear a thump. It's not Rory and I falling over. We're fine. So apologies for that if anything sneaks through. Yes. So where the meat and potatoes of our work sits is in stage 3, 4, maybe dipping into 5. If you're dipping into 5 at the end of therapy, that's a great outcome. That person now accepting feelings and a willingness to change. But then that self-actualization, as you've said, Rory, it happens within. It happens as part of personal development and constantly looking there. And the therapy may be the seed that kicks that off. And the person may get to stage 6, experiencing feelings fully and in the current moment. You've described it beautifully. I've got the handout here. The person deeply feels emotions in real time, trusts their inner experience. Think about that. They trust their inner experience. So that's not incongruence. Incongruence, as was shown in the theory, the client comes in not trusting their inner feelings. So here at stage 6, they are trusting their own inner feelings. They're not looking to you as the counsellor. They're looking to their true self and going, I know the way here. I can guide myself here. So, if we were seeing a client in stage 6, Rory, I guess we'd be doing the ending talk where we'd be saying, wow, looks like you've really made incredible progress.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you haven't got that self-guide to go forward on your own. So in stage 6, the person, a real life example, in a session, a client starts crying and says, right now I'm feeling so sad and tired of pretending I'm okay. I just want to be seen for who I really am. The emotions are vivid, real, and healing. That person is accepting them and accepting that the change lies within them. So it doesn't mean that at stage 6 you won't have sadness and you won't have challenges in your life. It just means that you will navigate it differently and you will recognize that you have the power as the individual to navigate through that, as opposed to needing someone to show you the way. And then I think if we go into stage 7, Rory, I don't know that I've seen the stage 7. I do know that when you were teaching the 7 stages of process right in the beginning, with the early days with the class, you'd say who thinks, you'd map yourself to which stage you're at. And when you get to stage 7 and you say who thinks they're at stage 7, if anybody puts their hand up, I think that, yeah, wow, there must be really a fully functioning person, or maybe they don't understand the theory that well, because the few make it there. Mother Teresa, maybe. Gandhi, maybe. Nelson Mandela, maybe. Stage 7. So the description, the person is open to new experience, lives authentically, continues to grow outside of therapy. They trust themselves and their process. And a real life example, a former client reflects. Notice here, it's a former client, because you're not going to be counselling somebody at stage 7 at all. That would be unethical, in the same way as stage 1 would be unethical. So a former client reacts, I've started setting boundaries at work and it feels empowering. I'm not afraid of conflict anymore because I know who I am and I know what I need. They use self-awareness to live meaningfully. That is 7 stages of process. So I've got a little summary table here. Stage 1, the key trait, rigid and closed. And the example, I don't need help, it's them. Stage 2 is external blame. They're the problem, not me. Stage 3, tentative self-talk. Maybe I feel these feelings. I'm not 100% sure. Maybe they're coming from in me. Stage 4, that emerging ownership. I notice I react strongly when XYZ happens. There's great power in that. I notice I react strongly when XYZ happens. And then stage 5, active self-reflection. I want to change how I handle myself and the situations around me. Stage 6, present emotion. Right now, I feel this, that, or the other. And that's okay, even if it is a negative feeling. And then stage 7, integration and growth. I trust myself and I feel free to grow. It's a beautiful theory, Rory.
It is. It's elegant. That's the term that Rogers used, and also another term that comes is homeostasis, the idea of growth. Because Rogers, let us not forget, spent a lot of his youth studying plants, animals, insects, all sorts of things, and you can really see that coming through in this theory. And just a little bit of a tip for those of you who may be writing assignments or case studies. Janet Tolan, who's a very well-respected person-centered therapist and has written a number of books, certainly on counselling skills, said it's rare to find someone who shows signs of being only in one stage at a time. At some point, a client may even seem to the counsellor to have gone backwards. So they're not particularly linear, but you will see in each stage a consistency. So you're not going to get someone who comes in at stage 5 and is the completely kind of cooked article, if you like, but they will show great signs of behaviors, traits, and a mindset that matches into stage 5. And one final thing before we kind of back out of this is that I've always said that person-centered therapy is like a 3-legged table. The first leg is the 19 propositions, the idea of lived experience, the philosophical underpin that Rogers was so enamored with and developed really throughout his career. The second is the 6 necessary and sufficient conditions for therapeutic change, which tells us about the sensibility of the therapist's practice and the kind of mindset that a therapist needs to adapt to be able to work as a person-centered practitioner. And then the final leg is the 7 stages of process, and it produces a tabletop that is solid, a solid theory that you can put anything on. But like with any 3-legged table, if you remove one of the legs, what happens? It falls over. So a final plea from me, don't really forget the 7 stages of process. It is just as important as all of Rogers' theory. And I think it's one that we use a lot in our practices and probably don't know we're using it.
Thank you, Rory. Great topics today. You've been listening to episode 340 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast.
Yes, we started off with ethical and sustainable practice. Can clients ask you to delete their data? A deep dive into a tricky subject. And as a reminder, we always say that you need to get really good advice if this happens, and that is echoed in the handout that we provide on this subject. In Practice Matters, it's an interview with Jeremy Sachs. He has a new book, and he talks deeply about male sexual abuse and how, as therapists, we need to understand not just the process of that, but also the intersectionality of it, how it affects different people in different areas of life. And then finally, in student services, we talked about the 7 stages of process, an important part of Rogerian therapy. And Ken and myself gave you a little talk through, and hopefully we've simplified it for your assignments and your case studies. Finally, we thank you from the bottom of our hearts for your subscriptions, shares, likes, listens. They really do mean the world to us. So until next time, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode by visiting counsellingtutor.com.